A biker raised a chair to attack the waitress, but he had no idea who was sitting in the corner. One hit could have changed her life forever. But then Ronda Rousey stood up, and what happened next silenced the entire cafe in an instant. No one expected the night to turn this fast. The evening was settling in like a tired traveler, lowering himself into a familiar chair. Through the wide front windows of the small city cafe, the last streaks of daylight stretched across the street, mixing with neon reflections of storefront signs and headlights of passing cars. It wasn't a fancy place, just a modest diner tucked between a hardware shop and a second-hand bookstore. The walls carried framed photos of sunsets, old movie posters, and stains that refused to be fully erased no matter how often they were scrubbed. The overhead lights hummed quietly, casting a gentle amber tone over the wooden tables and well-worn vinyl seats that creaked each time someone shifted their weight. Despite its imperfections, it had warmth, especially in the evenings when the workday crowd mellowed into softer voices and slower movements. The scent inside the cafe was a familiar blend: coffee grounds, grilled burgers, toasted bread, and just a hint of fryer oil that clung to the air like a memory of earlier rush hours. A jukebox in the corner played soft classic rock, though the occasional crackle in the speakers betrayed its age. The atmosphere was what many would call comforting, a place you could breathe without pretension. And yet under that comfort, there existed a faint, unspoken tension that belonged to tired people hiding their worries while trying to enjoy a quiet meal before life resumed its demands. The young waitress weaving between tables carried that tension like a weight strapped to her shoulders. Her name was Emma, though most customers never learned it. She was simply Miss Hey, or a silent nod with a tap on the table. She had been working for hours without a proper break, moving swiftly with a determined, if exhausted, grace. Her hair was tied into a ponytail that had loosened through constant motion. A few strands escaped and clung to her forehead, dampened by the steam and heat of the kitchen behind her. Her uniform, a simple black shirt and jeans beneath a faded green apron, was spotless, though clearly washed countless times. The soles of her worn sneakers were flattened and quiet from overuse. Whenever she found a second to breathe, she would reach into the pocket of her apron and check her phone. The screen was cracked at one corner, forming a spiderweb pattern that slightly distorted the message threads she constantly monitored. They were from someone who depended on her: short reminders, pleas for attention, updates about dinner, or a picture meant to lift her spirits from a young child at home. Each time she looked, her face softened for a moment before tightening again, with the awareness that she couldn't stay still for long. Bills were due. Her mother needed medicine. The job wasn't just a job, it was survival. Behind the counter stood the cafe's owner, Carl A. Man, with a kind but worn-out face marked by lines that mapped years of fighting to keep this place open. His apron was wrapped over a plaid shirt, and his hands never stopped moving. Pouring coffee, wiping the counter, nervously adjusting the order tickets that hung above the grill in the kitchen. He glanced toward the register constantly, arching his eyebrows at every receipt, as if mentally calculating whether the day's earnings would stretch far enough. The cafe was his whole life, built on stubborn hope and long hours. He wanted his employees to feel safe, but fear of confrontation often trapped him in silence. At a corner table, mostly unnoticed and perfectly comfortable with that fact, sat Ronda. Her presence did not draw attention in the way one might expect from someone who had spent years in glaring spotlights. She wore jeans and a faded gray hoodie, hair pulled casually back, no elaborate makeup, no signs of celebrity fanfare. To the casual eye, she was any other customer looking to unwind after a demanding day. She sat with one leg loosely crossed, her posture relaxed but subtly alert. Her gaze moved calmly across the room, picking up the details around her with the keenness of someone trained to read people long before they opened their mouths. Her meal was simple: coffee, a sandwich, and a glass of water. She ate slowly, absorbing the atmosphere with the quiet appreciation of someone who rarely got a moment alone, away from cameras and shouting crowds. She noticed the fatigue in Emma's steps, the stiff tension in Carl's shoulders, and the soft attempts of patrons to enjoy what peace they could muster. She saw a father gently cutting pancakes into pieces for his child, two high school students whispering about something funny on their phones, an office worker checking emails while taking hurried bites of a burger. Regular people living, coping, pushing through. These were the scenes that reminded Ronda of the world outside fame, the world that shaped her before arenas and bright lights ever did. When Emma approached her table earlier to take the order, Ronda gave her a polite nod and offered a small, genuine smile. It was enough to catch the subtle flicker of gratitude in Emma's eyes. That fleeting connection stayed with Ronda because beneath all that exhaustion, the young woman still fought to maintain kindness. It was the kind of strength Ronda respected more than any championship belt. In silence, she watched Emma bring orders to tables, clean up spills, and soothe complaints with soft apologies. The waitress handled everything with careful patience, even when her hands trembled slightly from fatigue. Outside, motorcycles rumbled past occasionally, a reminder of the city's varied personalities. Every time the heavy engines growled through the street, Emma's shoulders pulled a little tighter, as though bracing for a blow she hoped wouldn't come. The sounds faded each time, but the tension lingered just beneath her skin. Ronda noticed that too. She didn't know what those reactions meant, but her instincts, those razor-sharp senses honed through years of combat, picked up that Emma wasn't just tired. She was wary, apprehensive, prepared for something she prayed wouldn't arrive. The peace in the cafe felt fragile, like a soap bubble glimmering beautifully, but ready to burst at the slightest disturbance. The wooden floor creaked under footsteps. Glasses chimed gently as they were set on tables. Quiet chat and the jukebox filled the space. But there was something more, a stillness beneath the noise, a subtle alertness in the air. Ronda recognized it instinctively. She had felt it countless times before a fight, before a threat revealed itself, before chaos erupted. It was the pause before something changes. Emma made another trip past Ronda's table, carrying a fresh coffee pot to refill cups. She smiled mechanically but with effort, trying to hide just how drained she truly was. Ronda returned the smile, her eyes more expressive than her words would have been. She didn't intend to get involved in anything tonight. All she wanted was a quiet meal before heading out again. But the engines came back. Louder this time. The once distant rumble grew into a thunderous roar that shook the glass panes in their frames and made the overhead lights flicker. Several customers turned their heads toward the windows. Emma froze mid-step, the coffee pot trembling slightly in her grasp. A nervous hush swept through the cafe, conversations dissolving into silence as people waited to see if the noise would continue or pass by. Ronda's expression didn't change, but her body shifted subtly, grounding itself. Her eyes turned toward the entrance with a calm, steady focus. She didn't know what was coming, but she already sensed the balance tipping. Outside, engines revved once more, sharper, closer. The bubble of evening comfort stretched thin, and Emma finally exhaled, a small, fearful breath, as the door handle rattled under a push from the other side. The door slammed open with a force that made the bell overhead clang violently against its hook. The sound cut through the cafe like a blade, severing the soft comfort that moments before lingered in the warm lighting and gentle music. Cold air rushed in from outside, swirling around the entrance as heavy boots stamped across the threshold. Loud laughter, rough and booming, replaced the hushed tones of the customers who had been quietly enjoying their meals. A small group of bikers stepped inside as if they owned the place. Broad shoulders wrapped in black leather, chains clinking against buckles, and boots leaving faint streaks of dirt and grease across the floor. The smell of exhaust fumes and cigarette smoke followed the men like a cloud. They carried the presence of men who thrived on making others uncomfortable loud, unapologetic, hungry for attention and control. The leader of the group entered last, pausing in the doorway to scan the cafe as though selecting prey. His hair was shaved on the sides with a rough, unwashed mohawk running down the middle. A thick beard covered half his face, hiding much of his expression except for the smirk that curled his lips. He slammed the door shut with the back of his boot, sending another sharp echo throughout the room. Every conversation ceased. A toddler in a high chair turned wide eyes toward the intrusion, clutching his fork with tiny fingers. His parents exchanged worried glances. The two teenage boys who had been laughing at their phones suddenly found interest in their shoelaces. Even the jukebox seemed to lower its tone, or perhaps that was only how it felt as silence flooded the room. Emma, halfway through setting coffee cups on a freshly cleaned table, stiffened like a statue brought to life only by dread. The pot she held wobbled, nearly spilling onto the floor, but she caught herself at the last moment. She swallowed hard and forced her lips into the polite smile she had perfected for dealing with rude customers. But these men were not ordinary customers. The fear in her eyes betrayed exactly how familiar she was with their arrival. Rhonda watched the group with calm precision, her gaze not sharp with alertness yet, but attentive all the same. She saw how the bikers fanned out, claiming space without permission. They chose the largest booth near the center of the cafe, pushing chairs aside with unnecessary force to sit where they pleased. The legs of one chair scraped loudly across the tile as it was kicked away, knocking slightly into the table next to them. A woman dining alone flinched and scooted farther into her seat. The leader dropped into the booth like he was settling into a throne, arms stretched along the top of the seat, eyes scanning with bold arrogance. His companions leaned back, laughing at jokes only they understood, their coarse voices bouncing off the walls. They made no effort to blend in or respect the environment they invaded. To them, this cafe was merely a new place to dominate, a playground for their cruelty. Emma approached, trying to smooth out the tremble in her hands. She stood at the edge of the table, facing the group with her order pad ready. "What can I get you tonight?" she asked, voice soft but controlled. One of the bikers lifted his head and stared at her with a mean sort of amusement, as though she were something less than human. They ordered loudly, constantly changing their minds mid-sentence just to see her rewrite. One demanded extra pickles, then changed to no pickles, then extra onions instead. Another insisted she repeat their drink list 3 times, interrupting her every attempt with a mocking chuckle. They treated her like a puppet meant to dance for their entertainment. The entire time their leader stared at her silently, his eyes crawling over her in a way that made her chest tighten with discomfort. Once she walked away to give the order to the kitchen, the bikers spread their influence even further. One stretched his legs across the aisle, forcing the office worker who was leaving to uncomfortably maneuver around him, only to be met with a sarcastic whistle and a crude comment. Another flicked a used napkin deliberately onto the family's table, causing the mother to blanch and quickly wipe it away as she urged her child to finish eating. The father, jaw clenched, looked toward Carl behind the counter. But Carl, though visibly uneasy, didn't move from his position. His hands gripped the edge of the counter. He ran his tongue across his lips, wanting to say something, but paralyzed by the threat these men represented. He had heard stories about them before, rumors of fights, smashed windows, and police arriving too late. Confronting them felt like risking everything he had built. A table emptied near the door as the family gathered their things and left in a hurry, their eyes darting nervously back toward the bikers. Their departure didn't go unnoticed. One biker snorted and muttered something about scared little sheep, gaining a chorus of approving chuckles. Rhonda continued observing quietly, though her expression remained neutral. She watched the dynamic unfold, the way fear spread through the room like a silent disease. Strength and dominance were things she understood intimately, but what she saw from these men wasn't strength. It was the mask of strength worn by cowards who preyed on those unable to defend themselves. The music from the jukebox sputtered briefly before resuming with even lower volume, as if trying to not draw their attention. Emma returned, now carrying plates in both hands. She carefully placed their food down before them, burgers stacked with bacon, plates of loaded fries, onion rings dripping oil. The leader grabbed his burger by the bun and smashed it open with unnecessary force, causing ketchup to splatter across the table. When Emma accidentally brushed against one biker's elbow while serving a plate, he shoved his chair back and exclaimed loudly, "Watch what you're doing, sweetheart!" The chair leg banged into the stool behind him, jarring a salt shaker to the floor, where it rolled and rattled. Everyone in the cafe flinched simultaneously. Emma muttered an apology, even though she hadn't done anything wrong. Her knuckles turned white around her pen, and she avoided making eye contact. Rhonda's eyebrow twitched just once, like a small crack in her otherwise calm demeanor. She took a sip of water, set the glass down with quiet deliberation, and continued to watch. More customers slipped out quietly, unable to enjoy their meals under the oppressive presence of the newcomers. The cafe, once a safe harbor for weariness, slowly transformed into a captive space ruled by intimidation. Even the fryers sizzling from the kitchen sounded timid, like a creature hiding from predators. Emma delivered refills, forced to return to a table she wished she could avoid. Each time she approached, the bikers grew bolder with their insults. They snickered at her apron, mocked her voice, questioned whether she had the intelligence to remember their orders. She endured it all with her lips pressed into a line, holding tightly to the last threads of her composure. Carl kept glancing toward the door, and then at the phone sitting beside the register. But his fingers never reached for it. Calling the police felt like lighting a fuse, the kind that might bring the whole cafe down on their heads before help could even arrive. Rhonda recognized the fear. She saw it in how the room held its collective breath, in the way customers looked away rather than risk eye contact with their tormentors. She saw it in Emma's attempts to be invisible, except when required to serve. Rhonda was not yet part of the story, but she could feel herself being drawn into its gravity, one cue at a time. The bikers continued laughing at the discomfort they caused, soaking up every ounce of control they had stolen from the room. They were not here to eat. They were here to dominate. And little by little, the cafe shrank around them, bending to their will. Rhonda's meal sat half finished, though she never looked away for long. Her eyes moved with the fluid, silent calculation of someone who foresaw a storm forming from the smallest of shifts. The engines had brought them here, and now the tension they carried with them was seeping into every crack of the cafe's foundation. These men didn't just walk into the diner, they took it, and every person still sitting inside felt the captivity tightening like a fist. The food had been delivered, the drinks poured, and still the laughter from the central booth only grew louder and more disruptive, spreading tension through the room like a choking fog. The bikers devoured their meals with exaggerated noise, smacking their lips, slamming their glasses onto the table, tossing crumpled napkins across the plates as though daring someone to comment. Fries were flicked back and forth, and greasy fingerprints collected on everything they touched. The others in the cafe watched uneasily, every eye flickering toward them, and then away again, afraid to be noticed. Emma, doing her best to focus on the task at hand, wiped down a counter with slow, careful strokes, giving herself a moment to calm the racing inside her chest. She tried to pace her breathing, tried to think only about the next small step, collect the empty plates from table 5, bring out dessert to table 2, but every loud burst of laughter or sudden movement from the bikers snapped her nerves taut, like frayed strings pulled too tight. Her tray rattled slightly each time she lifted it, and she prayed silently that no one noticed the tremors in her hands. Eventually, the bikers had cleared their plates, leaving behind a mess that looked like a small battlefield, a collage of crushed buns, ketchup smears, and overturned containers of dipping sauce. They lounged in their seats like kings drunk on their own dominance, leaning back with full bellies and smug, satisfied grins. They'd consumed everything they ordered, and then they made no effort to move. They simply stayed, sprawled out and taking up space, even as the cafe emptied around them. It fell to Emma because it always did to approach them once more. She wiped her palms against her apron before forcing her legs forward. Each step felt like it dragged through mud. Still she went because this was her job, and she needed this job like she needed air. When she reached the table, she cleared her throat softly. "Would you like anything else?" Her voice sounded thin, too quiet, and she feared they would use even that against her. The leader lifted his gaze slowly, as though granting her attention was a gift she didn't deserve. His lips curled upward in a lopsided grin that wasn't friendly in the slightest. "Yeah," he said, stretching the word out like a game. "I'd like you to relax. You're shaking like a leaf." His companions erupted into laughter again, loud enough to rattle the silverware. Emma's cheeks flushed, but she kept her composure. "If you're finished, I can bring your check now," she said, trying to hold their stares without losing her nerve entirely. For a moment, they simply stared back at her, the air between them tightening with confrontation. The leader leaned forward slowly, arms resting on the table, shoulders squared in challenge. "Check?" he repeated, as if the word itself offended him. Then he laughed, but this laughter wasn't carefree. It was sharp-edged, dripping with hostility. "We're not paying for this garbage," the others chimed in immediately. "Yeah, we did you a favor, even coming here. You should be paying us." Food's barely worth feeding to a dog. The words struck Emma like slaps. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but nothing came out at first. She felt her throat tighten. All she managed was, "I'm sorry you feel that way, but we do need payment for the meal." The leader snorted and slapped the table hard with the flat of his palm. The plates jumped. Emma nearly did too. "Listen close," he said, lowering his voice, letting the menace inside it drip onto her nerves. "We don't pay, and if anyone here has a problem with that—" He reached for a glass and tipped it on its side, letting the remaining soda spill lazily across the table and drip onto the floor. "We'll just smash this place to pieces." As if to punctuate the point, one of the bikers kicked the empty chair beside him, making it skid violently across the tile. It collided with another table leg, and a knife clattered loudly to the ground. The family who had lingered in hopes of finishing their meal now made a hurried escape, collecting their bags and coats with shaky hands. The child stared at Emma, eyes wide with concern she didn't know how to soothe. Carl finally stepped forward a few inches from behind the counter, as though his instincts screamed at him to protect his business, but the fear held him in place like invisible chains. He wiped his hands on his apron, sweat dampening the fabric. His eyes pleaded at Emma from across the room, begging her to calm things down, even if it meant letting these men walk all over them. Survival of his cafe, his livelihood, mattered more to him in that moment than pride. Emma didn't look at him. She felt utterly alone facing the storm in front of her. Yet something inside her, something shaped by every long night, every rude comment swallowed, every injustice endured, refused to let her crumble. Her voice, though cracking, found its way out. You can't just threaten to destroy this place. You ate your food. You need to pay." A cruel silence followed. The bikers stared at her as though she had suddenly changed shape. No longer a harmless server, but a target they were allowed to hit. One man stood abruptly, pushing his chair back with such force that it toppled over completely. The crash rang out like a gunshot. He stepped closer to her, invading her space. "Who do you think you are?" he growled, his breath sour and hot against her face. "Some tough girl? You think we're scared of you?" Emma stepped back instinctively, but only a half step. She didn't want to run. Her heart hammered wildly in her chest, screaming at her to flee. But she held her ground because someone had to, even if it terrified her, even if her knees trembled like loose hinges. She met his glare, eyes shining not with confidence but with determination, born from sheer need. Rhonda watched all of this unfold from her seat, her movements still slow and deliberate. She set down her glass of water. Her breath was steady, her shoulders loose, but her awareness sharpened. She was not yet standing, but she was also no longer simply a tourist in this scene. Every muscle beneath her hoodie hummed with controlled readiness. The leader rose too, towering over Emma, and shoved his finger against her chest with condescending force. "We told you," he said, voice dripping menace. "We don't pay. And if you ask again—" He traced a slow line through the air, indicating the tables, the chairs, the lights above. "This whole dump gets turned upside down, got it?" The cafe had nearly emptied by now, but those who remained silent, tense, afraid, began to watch with dread. Some had their phones in hand, unsure whether to record or dial for help, but none stepped forward. Fear kept them locked in their seats. Fear had a way of silencing crowds. Emma shook her head, though she knew she might regret it. "This isn't just a dump," she said softly. "This is someone's livelihood. You don't get to ruin it just because you want to act tough." There was a charged pause. No laughter, no snide remarks, just a shift-a-click, as though something inside the leader's head slid into place. He grabbed the nearest table edge with both hands and ripped it upward in one violent motion. The legs scraped loudly, lifting into the air like a weapon raised overhead. The gesture was not playful now, not a bluff or a tease. It was an attack waiting to land, a threat seconds from becoming harm. Emma gasped and stumbled backward, heart leaping into her throat. The lights above reflected the angle of the table and the muscles tightening in his arms. Everything froze. The customers, Carl, even the jukebox seemed to hold its breath. Only one person moved. Rhonda stood. She didn't shout or announce herself. She didn't posture or threaten. She merely rose with quiet precision and purpose and started walking forward. She walked not just into the open space at the center of the cafe, but into the tension that had been suffocating everyone all evening. Those who noticed her movement turned their heads in disbelief, eyes widening with surprise and something like hope. The table was rising higher. Emma braced herself, eyes wide with terror, and Rhonda continued forward, her gaze now locked entirely onto the man holding the table aloft, a predator unaware that his moment of triumph was about to turn into something else entirely, something he had never expected, something he would soon regret. Rhonda closed the last steps between her and the chaos with a calmness that didn't belong in a room filled with trembling fear. While everyone else remained frozen, trapped in silent horror, she moved with deliberate certainty, her presence slicing through the atmosphere like a sudden shift in gravity. Emma saw her only as a blur stepping into view, and for a fleeting heartbeat, her terror softened into astonished confusion. She hadn't expected help. She hadn't dared hope for it. The biker's arms were tense as he held the table overhead, veins standing out like ropes beneath his skin. His smirk twisted cruelly as he anticipated the flinch, the scream, the collapse of the woman he intended to terrify. But his eyes flickered when Rhonda stepped directly between them, placing herself as a barrier without hesitation, her stance relaxed, yet unshakably firm. "Back off," the leader growled, though his voice wavered just slightly, not with fear, but with frustration that his momentary thrill of dominance was being interrupted. Rhonda didn't respond. She didn't bother acknowledging his attempt to assert control. Instead, she shifted her weight ever so subtly, feet planting solidly on the ground, chest squared and shoulders low, like a fighter slipping into familiar territory. The table came down, but not as he intended. Rhonda stepped in, hands locking onto the table's edge before momentum could reach Emma. With a sharp, efficient twist of her hip and a precise pull that redirected the brute force, the table's weight shifted away from Emma entirely. The biker, who had expected the resistance of gravity instead of a trained counterforce, stumbled forward, his boots skidding on the polished tiles. His surprise robbed him of balance. The table clattered down sideways with a loud crash, legs screeching as they scraped across the floor. The sound was so sharp that a glass on a nearby table shivered before tipping, rolling off and breaking into shards. Gasps rippled across the room as the leader pitched forward like a charging bull, whose horns had suddenly vanished. His shoulder struck the edge of the counter, sending a sharp jolt through his body. He cursed and tried to right himself quickly, but he could not reclaim his menace as easily as before. Rhonda did not advance with aggression. She merely held her ground, her breathing steady, her eyes locked onto his with a measured control that unnerved him. She hadn't hit him. She hadn't even touched him with her fists. But she had dismantled his intimidation, the foundation of his power, so completely that the entire cafe felt the shift. For the first time since they entered, the bikers were silent. Emma stared at Rhonda's back, her expression shifting from terror to a trembling sort of awe. She had been bracing herself for pain, expecting to feel the table slam down or her body shoved aside. But instead, she now saw a human shield where moments ago she stood alone. Shock flowed through her like electricity, shorting out the panic that had gripped her chest. The leader regained his footing with a grunt, rage clouding his features. His buddies, who had been lounging smugly just minutes before, sat forward now, their bravado cracking into disbelief. The air in the cafe thickened, not with fear this time, but with anticipation. Something unstoppable had been set in motion. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" the leader spat as he wiped a strand of greasy hair from his forehead. He loomed closer, his breath heavy and toxic with frustration. He swung an arm toward Rhonda, trying to shove her aside like she was just another civilian to bully. Rhonda reacted before his hand ever touched her. Her palm met his wrist with a lightning-fast parry, fingers wrapping around the joint with surgical precision. She guided his momentum downward and forward, his body folding awkwardly as his own force betrayed him. His knees buckled, and in an instant, he was on the ground face, nearly pressed against the cool floor tiles. Rhonda's stance never faltered. She controlled him with nothing more than gravity and a calculated twist of leverage. A stunned silence settled across the cafe once more. The customers who remained exchanged wide-eyed looks, unable to believe what they were witnessing. Carl stood frozen at the counter, lips parted in disbelief. After years of watching people like these bikers do whatever they pleased, he saw someone break the pattern. It didn't feel real yet. The leader groaned, his pride visibly shattered along with his balance. He tried to scramble up quickly, still determined not to look beaten, but his movements were sloppy, clumsy, nothing like the dominant figure who had strutted in moments before. His companions blinked, trying to process the sudden inversion of roles. Rhonda took a single step back, granting him space not for his sake, but because she didn't need him beneath her heel to keep control. She remained perfectly centered, chin level, hands loose. No threat, no bark-only assurance. The kind that came from absolute confidence. Emma, still just inches behind her, felt a sudden rush of air fill her lungs, as though she'd forgotten to breathe until that moment. Her shaking hands lowered from their defensive position. She wasn't protected by a locked door or a police officer. She was protected by one woman who had decided enough was enough. The leader turned toward his gang with a furious glare, silently demanding reinforcement, needing to salvage his pride. The others blinked at him, confusion and hesitation clashing in their expressions. They were used to him being the aggressor. They weren't used to seeing him knocked off balance, literally and figuratively, by someone who hadn't even broken a sweat. Rhonda's gaze followed his silently shifting demand. She could feel the collective pulse of decision among the group. Fight or flee. Attack or back down. Cowards often chose more cowardice, but only after trying to deny it first. He pushed up to his feet again, shoulders shaking not with fear but with fury. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, eyes narrowing like a cornered animal. The humiliation burned hotter than any pain, and humiliation had a way of making dangerous men reckless. His lips curled into a smile that showed too many teeth. "You think this is over?" he snarled. "You think we're done?" The others stood now as well, their boots scraping the floor, chairs groaning from the sudden shift in weight. The tension mounted with every breath they took. Their egos demanded retaliation, their pride refusing to let them walk away from a challenge met head-on by a woman who dared deny their control. But Rhonda remained where she was. She did not shift her feet. She did not raise her fists. She only inhaled once, deeply, her posture loose and ready. She was not afraid of the fight that was coming. No, she was prepared for it. What the bikers didn't know yet, what Emma and Carl and every silent, terrified spectator were slowly realizing, was that the moment the leader raised that table, he hadn't just started a fight, he had already lost it. For a heartbeat that felt unnaturally long, the cafe held its breath. The leader remained crouched awkwardly on the floor, where Rhonda had forced him down, his hands splayed against the tile, ego cracked wide open. His crew stared, eyes darting between him and the woman who stood so effortlessly composed before them. Then, with a single forced bark of laughter, one biker broke the silence like someone popping a balloon to show they were not afraid. The others followed suit, laughter erupting in exaggerated bursts that ricocheted off the walls. It was too loud, too forced an attempt to plaster over the shift in power everyone had witnessed. The leader squeezed his eyes shut, jaw clenching as the sound echoed around him. He knew they were trying to salvage their pride, and he needed them to believe he was still the one in control. He shoved himself upright, wiping his palms on his jeans, as if removing dirt rather than humiliation. His posture changed, shoulders squared, stomach pushed forward, head tilted back like he towered above the world again. "What's your problem?" he snapped at Rhonda, pointing a finger at her chest. "Think you're some kind of hero?" Rhonda didn't flinch. She didn't react at all. Her breathing remained calm and grounded. The leader's anger sparked hotter at being ignored. He took another arrogant step forward, grabbing her hoodie by the front without thinking ahead. The motion was fast, but her reaction was faster. Her hand clamped around his wrist, fingers locking down like steel. With a pivot of her hips and a controlled shift of weight, she redirected his aggressive pull into momentum he couldn't control. He hit the floor again, but this time the landing was not just awkward. It was painful. His breath escaped his lungs in a harsh grunt as his back slapped the tiles. Rhonda maintained her grip just long enough to ensure he didn't counter, then released him before he could react. The second takedown changed everything. The laughter stopped. Someone gasped. Another muttered something under their breath. A chair leg scratched against the floor as a biker stood too quickly. The leader rolled over, shock flooding his expression. A hint of fear flashed in his eyes, not fear of Ronda's strength, but fear of what the others would think of his weakness. The two men closest to him finally reacted, not thoughtfully, not strategically, but like animals responding to a wounded alpha. They lunged at Ronda at the same time. One reached to grab her shoulder from the left, while the other swung his fist from the right, trying to catch her off guard. She didn't bother to retreat. She slid slightly left, letting the fist cut through empty air. The man's knuckles met nothing but gravity as he stumbled forward, off balance. Ronda grabbed the other biker's forearm, twisted and dropped her weight, sending him flipping over her hip to crash directly onto a fallen chair. The wooden legs splintered under his mass, and he howled in shock. The punch thrower came back around, red-faced and raging. Without looking, Ronda lifted her elbow sharply, connecting with his chest. The breath hissed out of him as he lurched backward, collapsing into his own friend who scrambled to get up. In a blink, the two lay in a tangled, groaning heap. The third biker, the one who had stayed seated, watching, finally felt compelled to act. His hesitation disappeared in a roar fueled less by bravery and more by the sudden terror of being the last man sitting. He lunged toward Ronda with arms outstretched, aiming to wrap her in a clumsy hold. She spun, letting his grasp close around empty space, and swept his legs out from under him. His boots flew skyward as his back smacked flat onto the tiles. His limbs sprawled weakly, his shock loud enough to echo even in silence. Ronda didn't stop moving. She turned her attention briefly to the leader, who had managed to climb up once more, teeth bared in frustration. He swung a wild fist toward her jaw, desperate to land a blow that could restore his pride. She ducked beneath the arc of his arm, stepped behind him, and applied just enough pressure between his shoulder blades to send him slamming into the table he'd so proudly lifted earlier. His ribs collided with the edge, and the groan that followed was not that of a victor. No dramatic spin, no flashy moves, just technique honed through years of discipline. He tried to rise again. She didn't let him. A quick twist of his wrist pinned his arm behind his back, forcing him still with a joint lock that whispered a promise of breaking bones if he dared resist. The others, scattered around the floor, groaned and writhed but made no effort to stand. The fight was no longer a fight. It was a lesson already learned. Ronda stepped back only when she was certain none of them had the will to continue. Her breathing was steady, her pulse barely quickened. She looked no more disheveled than someone who had simply risen from their seat to stretch. The cafe, once thick with fear, now buzzed with shock. The few remaining customers sat wide-eyed, phones raised as they recorded every second, too stunned to cheer but no longer afraid to witness. Carl stood rigid behind the counter, glasses slipped down his nose from leaning forward in disbelief. He wasn't just watching a stranger fight. He was watching his cafe be defended when he hadn't been brave enough to try. Emma's legs nearly gave out as relief flooded her body. Her throat tightened and tears threatened, but she blinked rapidly, refusing to let them fall. She stared at Ronda's back, feeling safety for the first time in hours, maybe days. The floor beneath her feet no longer felt like thin ice. She had someone standing in front of her now. Someone who didn't back down. The leader wheezed as he tried to gather the scraps of his shattered ego. His men lay helpless around him, defeated by a woman they had laughed at, underestimated, ignored. Ronda didn't look triumphant. She simply looked done. Her eyes scanned the cafe, ensuring the danger had truly passed, before settling once more on Emma. There was no arrogance there, no expectation of praise, just a quiet reassurance. You're safe now. The leader's chest rose and fell in angry, sputtering breaths. His pride, more wounded than his body, still desperately tried to salvage the illusion of power. But as his eyes traveled up to the woman above him, standing calm and strong, he saw truth instead. The fear that had controlled the room for so long no longer worked. The bikers were no longer predators. They were prey. For a long second, the cafe remained motionless, as if the entire building was catching its breath. The bikers lay sprawled across the floor, groaning in disbelief and pain, stripped of the swagger they carried like armor. Their leader stared up at Ronda from his knees, chest heaving, eyelids twitching as if struggling to process the reality in front of him. His pride had driven him to violence, but now that same pride chained him in place, defeated and humiliated under the weight of a woman who hadn't even broken a sweat. Rhonda's stance relaxed only slightly. She wasn't afraid of retaliation, if anything, she expected it. But the menace that had polluted the air earlier dissolved into something else. The bikers no longer looked like threats. They looked like fools nursing their egos, their toughness exposed as nothing more than noise. Emma stepped forward cautiously, her shoes lightly tapping the tile floor. Her heart still thudded against her ribs, but the terror no longer drowned out her thoughts. She stood just behind Rhonda's shoulder, hands clasped tightly in front of her to stop them from trembling. Her voice came out soft, carefully controlled but carrying newfound courage. "You all need to leave," she said. The leader flinched not from pain, but from the sting of hearing a woman he tried to break now giving him orders. He opened his mouth to spit another insult, another excuse to hold on to power. But one look from Rhonda, steady, alert, and absolutely prepared, stopped his words cold. Instead, he attempted to stand, his movements clumsy and graceless. His crew scrambled to collect themselves, clutching their bruises and casting nervous glances toward the door. They seemed smaller than before, shrunken by the reality of what had just unfolded. They staggered toward the exit with the frantic, stumbling urgency of men who knew staying any longer would only deepen their humiliation. At the threshold, the leader paused and looked back at Rhonda with a shaky snarl. Anger swelled in his gaze, a promise of vengeance whispered in silence. But Rhonda's expression met his with unwavering boredom, as if daring him to make the worst mistake of his life. His jaw clenched tight, and finally he hissed out a curse under his breath, turned away, and shoved the door open. The bell above it chimed mockingly as the gang retreated into the night, engines growling like defeated beasts licking their wounds. Silence followed. Not the suffocating kind from before. This one felt light, free. The tension that had crawled into every corner of the cafe evaporated as customers slowly began to breathe again. A few stood, glancing through the windows to ensure the threat truly disappeared into the dark. Others stared openly at Rhonda, their shock giving way to awe, admiration, even gratitude. Carl came out from behind the counter, wiping his hands on his apron, though they didn't need wiping. He looked at Rhonda with a combination of disbelief and admiration, searching for the right words. I don't know how to thank you," he finally managed. "If you hadn't been here—" Rhonda shrugged lightly, as though brushing off the idea that she had done anything heroic. "They were hurting people," she said simply. "That wasn't going to happen on my watch." Her voice was calm, grounded, spoken like someone who did not need to shout to be powerful. Emma's breath caught at the sound of it. She turned to face Rhonda fully, and for the first time that night, her expression softened into a genuine smile. Small but warm and full of relief. "Thank you," she whispered, the gratitude trembling on her lips. Rhonda met her gaze and nodded once, a silent acknowledgement that no further explanation was needed. But behind that calm, she could see the truth in Emma's eyes. This wasn't just about a shift gone wrong. It was about every day she had walked into work afraid of what might happen, and every day she walked out still carrying that fear home. Customers began to approach, speaking over one another in excited rushes, thanking Rhonda, praising her bravery, recapping the fight with animated gestures that grew more dramatic with every retelling. Some recorded the aftermath, trying to capture just a piece of what had happened. A few even asked for selfies, though Rhonda waved them off politely. She hadn't stepped in to become a spectacle. Meanwhile, Emma hurried to gather broken glass and scattered silverware, though her movements lacked the frantic desperation from before. She cleaned because she wanted to reclaim her workplace, not because fear pushed her into the task. Carl stepped in to help, his hands steadying as he realized his cafe was still standing, intact, stronger even. A small applause suddenly broke out from a table near the back. Then another. The scattered clapping grew louder as more joined in, until the cafe pulsed with honest appreciation. Rhonda stood there, slightly awkward at the attention, rubbing the back of her neck like someone far more comfortable in a cage fight than under a spotlight of gratitude. Emma wiped her eyes quickly, not wanting anyone to see her tears. But Rhonda saw them anyway. She placed a gentle hand on Emma's shoulder. And the young woman looked up at her, a little startled. You did the brave part, Rhonda said quietly. You stood your ground. Emma let out a shaky laugh, disbelieving but touched. I was terrified, she admitted. Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared, Rhonda replied. It means you don't let fear make your choices. Those words struck something deep inside Emma. She nodded slowly, committing them to memory like a promise she would hold on to. Outside, the engines of the defeated gang faded into distant noise. Life began returning to the cafe. The jukebox restarted with a soft, uncertain melody. Customers settled back into their conversations, though their voices carried more energy, no more life. Carl returned with a steaming cup of fresh coffee and placed it gently in front of Rhonda. On the house, he said with a sincere but slightly shaky smile. Rhonda gave him a nod of thanks and took a sip, savoring the warmth spreading through her hands and chest. The adrenaline of the moment slowly dissipated, leaving behind the quiet hum of satisfaction that came from doing what was right without hesitation. Emma approached one more time, but this time she didn't bring a tray or an order pad. She simply stood beside Rhonda, breathing in a calm she had nearly forgotten existed. People like you, she said softly. We need more of them. Rhonda looked across the cafe, at the small business saved from ruin, at the customers who now smiled instead of cowering, at a young woman who had rediscovered her voice. Anyone can stand up, she replied. Sometimes all it takes is someone to show it's possible. As the night returned to its familiar rhythm and safety settled in like a warm blanket, Rhonda remained just a quiet customer who had finished her meal. She didn't want a parade or applause. She wanted normalcy, moments of peace in a world too often bruised by cruelty. She took another sip of coffee, allowing herself to rest for a moment longer. But she knew she wouldn't stay long. There was always another place, another person who needed someone to step forward before fear swallowed them whole. That was the world she lived in, a world she refused to let bullies rule. Emma watched her with gratitude burning bright in her eyes, knowing she would never forget this night. And Carl, unnoticed behind the counter, replaced a broken glass with a new one, his confidence in his cafe quietly restored. When Rhonda finally rose to leave, slipping her hands into her hoodie pocket and giving Emma a reassuring smile, the cafe no longer felt like the same small, frightened place. It felt stronger. It felt safe, because someone had stood up and shown everyone else how.